this evening to have a speaker the caliber of Mr. Boyko, Mr. John Boyko, to be here to address us. And it's something that I think we'll find quite memorable and is very fitting for our annual general meeting. Also, we're very pleased to have John's father, John Sr., with us this evening. Welcome, John. And back in the late 1960s, I was, where was I living? I was hanging out somewhere. I think I was living in Lakefield, but I spent a lot of time in Peterborough around the hockey arenas, and the Boyko family moved up here from Hamilton, Burlington area. And they had some fine hockey players. And they were very good hockey players. They played the game the way it should have been played, and I'm sure their father was quite instrumental in telling them that and showing them that. They played with passion, and they played physical, but they were not dirty, and they were not rough. And that was admirable, and I remember them very well as hockey players. Now let me tell you a bit about our speaker. Listen to the qualifications that John has. And he's a Lakefield boy, if we can claim him. We're a little late in life, but we're going to claim him anyway, John. John Boyko is a historian, an author, and a speaker. He is an editorial page contributor who has written for the Globe and Mail, the Ottawa Citizen, the Calgary Herald, Montreal Gazette, Maclean's Magazine, and several more. He has appeared countless times on television and radio, and before audiences across our nation. John has written 5 books addressing Canadian history and politics, including The Last Steps to Freedom, The Evolution of Canadian Racism, Into the Hurricane, Bennett the Rebel, Who Challenged and Changed a Nation. Now, we have a good selection of John's books back there, and when John finishes, Derry will announce a short break. I'd like you to go back and peruse them, because this is one opportunity you have for the author to personally sign your copy. And they're quite reasonably priced, and they're beautiful books that make quite a collection. There's no other reason to prop up the corner of that bed that the leg broke off. I think I missed one book, Blood and Daring, How Canada Fought the American Civil War and Forged a Nation. John's next book is entitled Kennedy and the Canadians, and there isn't a more remarkable soul in the 20th century than John F. Kennedy. I carry around a 50-cent American piece as a good luck charm of JFK. So it'd be really wonderful to see this book, and I've carried it for about 20 years. Haven't had any luck, but I'm hoping. Really hoping that we're able to get this book and have a look at it, John. And sure we will. A contract has been signed for the book, and very probably it will be turned into a movie. So we not only have an author, we have a television and a movie writer, right, with among us. Yeah. John has earned degrees from Trent University, Queen's, McMaster, and he is the former Dean of History at the Lakefield College School. Now he is semi-retired and the director of the college school's summer programs. He has served on many local boards and has been elected to municipal office. He is now the guitarist and singer in a rock band called The Footnotes that plays the first Tuesday of every month in Lakefield's new Canoe and Paddle, the old Hamlin's restaurant. John grew up in Peterborough, but for 26 years he has lived in Lakefield, and we are glad to have him as a citizen. Please help me give a warm welcome to John Boyko. John.
Thank you for that tremendous introduction. I can't help but disappoint after that. I should say thank you and run for the door. and you even got introduced. So if I screw up too bad, you can just take over. So if it starts to go really badly, just take the mic from me and carry on. Yeah, I've lived in Lakefield for 26 years, so that makes me something of a newcomer, I know. I still live in the old Pleured house, I heard just a few months ago, despite the fact that they haven't lived there for 26 years. Someday it may be the Boyko house, but I know it'll take 2 or 3 generations. Something that I am really happy with is that I am able to come and speak with you tonight, because since a number of books have been published, I've traveled the country, as Dean said, and when I go all over the place and speak with folks, but to be able to hop in the car and to drive here in 2 minutes and speak for here is an absolute marvel. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. The book that I've been asked to speak about, and I'd be very happy to, is this one, if I can grab it. And this is the most recent. This is called Blood and Daring: How Canada Fought the American Civil War and Forged a Nation. And I'll talk a little bit about this, and I'll talk specifically about this guy on that side, Sir John A. Macdonald. And I'll mention this guy too, the one with the beard. I can't recall his name right now, but we'll talk about him as well. One of the things, being an author, besides going around and speaking with good people like you, is that I get interviewed a lot. And I'm going to challenge you with the question that I was asked. Are there any Americans here? Yes?
My father was born in the U.S.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, you can't play. But everyone else, I will give you the question that I was asked. This was on the radio. No, this was a magazine that was published from Louisiana State University. It was a Civil War magazine that was published just in the States, called The Civil War something, I forget. And she was interviewing me for the book, and so I was sitting in my office answering her questions, but her very first comment was, I read the book and I enjoyed it. And that is always nice when you're being interviewed by a reporter, because so often they have not read it at all. And so this was nice. It was a good start. But then she said, you know, this Sir John A. Macdonald person seems like he's quite a big deal. I was polite to my American friend and said, well, yes, he was and remains quite a big deal. Now here's the challenge. Here's the question I was asked, and here's the question that I'm going to ask you. She said, for my American readers, none of whom will have ever heard of this man, deep breath, I wonder if you could, for me, sum up why he matters to Canada in one sentence. Okay, to the person sitting beside you, go ahead, take that challenge. One sentence, why does Sir John A. Macdonald matter? Go ahead, I'll wait. Okay, not bad. I heard, because as Mr. Allen knows, I'm an old teacher, getting older by the minute, and so I have the ability that never goes away to focus in on certain conversations. You ever wonder how teachers can do that? I heard first Prime Minister over and over. I heard the word railroad come from over here somewhere. I heard a drinker, yes, okay, yes. Here's what I said to my American friend. I said, well, Sir John A. Macdonald is very important to Canada because he is like your James Madison in that he wrote our Constitution, the Constitution that is still in force in Canada today. Semicolon. Plus, he is very much like your Thomas Jefferson in that he formed the ideological basis that remains the foundation on which Canada is built. Semicolon. He is also like your George Washington in that he was our first chief executive, and as such completely understood that everything he said and did was going to be seen as a precedent for every chief executive that followed. Dash. So therefore, I'm feeling like Victor Borge here. But so anyway, that means that he was You're James Madison, you're Thomas Jefferson, and you're George Washington, all wrapped into one man. Thank you. That's it. Now, I was so proud of myself. Wow, that was actually pretty good. I didn't say it. I just thought that was actually pretty good. And she sent me a copy of the magazine, and it wasn't in there. She did not put it in at all. But that's what builds the humility when you're being interviewed by certain people. And what I think I would like to do tonight is to talk about Sir John. It is, after all, the year of his 200th birthday. His birthday was in January the 15th, and he would have turned 200. And so all across Canada we're celebrating his birthday. And when we celebrate his birthday, there's a number of people that are talking about some nasty bits of business that he took care of. He was using a measurement of today, something of a racist with respect especially to Native people and especially to the navvies, the Chinese people that he brought over to work in the railroad and then tried to kick them out when they were done. So that's true. Let's take all that and put it in this box and put it over there. He was also the man whose vision enabled him to create the country, whose vision enabled him to build the country both on steel rails and behind terrafalls. And he was also the man who saved the country. So what I would like to talk about is, we'll forget the building part, but let's talk about him creating the country and saving the country. Creating the country, many of us know parts of the story. The saving, I don't think many people know about that part of the story, and I certainly knew very little about it when I was researching this book. And part of the glory of researching a book is I get to spend all kinds of time in archives reading old papers and reading dusty old documents, and I am such an amazing geek when it comes to that stuff. But what the heck, you're members of an historical society, so you're up there in the geek scale already. So you join me in my fascination with all of those old books, old documents, and the things that I think I knew, and then found out I didn't really understand at all. Fascinate me. It's that curiosity that keeps me going. So let's talk about Sir John A. as a creator and Sir John A. as a builder. Not surprisingly, let's talk about the Civil War with respect to that. I'm going to read you a little bit from the book. I swear I'm only going to read one paragraph only, in order to contextualize what I'm going to say. I'm going to read the very first paragraph in the book. It says, "The ghosts remain active. Even after the passage of more than a century and a half, the American Civil War's ideas, promise, and pain still resonate. An understanding of the war is crucial to all who wish to comprehend America's civic conversation, to comprehend America itself. Similarly, no one can fully understand Canada without appreciating that the war was an essential factor in the country's birth, when and how it came about, as well as shaping the fundamental ideas upon which it is based. While saving itself by creating itself, Canada was intricately involved in the war's cause and course. Despite the efforts of America's wartime leaders, Canada's actions during and after the conflict kept Canada from becoming American. We owe it to ourselves to understand the Civil War, to heed its whispering ghosts." You see, what a lot of people don't think about is that, yes, the country that we know today was formed in 1867 in Confederation, but the meetings that put it together happened 3 years before, in 1864. Now think about that when you think that the American Civil War was from 1861 to 1865. It happened right in the middle of the Civil War. And it happened largely as a result of the American Civil War. Canada would not have been formed when it was or how it was without the American Civil War. So let's talk about him with respect to that. I believe that no matter how important the idea is that a book is trying to put across, if it is not interesting, if it is not inclusive, that is, it doesn't include the reader in what's going on, if it's not at least a little bit entertaining, then forget it. No matter how interesting or how important the idea, people will not be invited in. So the way that I decided that I was going to invite people into this idea was through 6 guides. What I would do is I would set up 6 people, and they would be like people who would take you at the outside of a museum and bring you in and say, now this is important, and this is interesting. Let's take a look at them together. The first guide that I chose was a man by the name of John Anderson. John Anderson was a slave. He grew up in Missouri, and he watched, when he was 9 years old, his mother get beaten down and nearly killed by the white woman whose husband owned her, because only men could own slaves. The reason that I went to Richmond. In Richmond they have a museum there, and it's a Civil War museum, except it's not. It's the Museum of the Confederacy. Not once do they call it a civil war. A civil war, this guide said in his fine accent, was a civil war is when 2 factions are fighting to control the state. We did not have a civil war. We formed our own country, sir, and we were invaded. Now you picture that museum opened in 1954. How many school kids have been through that Civil War museum and told that story? So in their minds, the Civil War ended last Tuesday. But I digress again. William Seward went into Lincoln. This is before he was even president. And he said, here's what you should do on your very first day, Mr. Lincoln. Lincoln said, yes. You should gather the army and invade Canada. That's what Lincoln said. Oh, you should invade Canada, and here's why. 1, Britain would not allow that to stand. Therefore, they would declare war on us. And that's a good thing, because those people in the South hate Britain more than they even hate us. So therefore, they would forget about all this stuff. They would rally around you and rally around the flag in order to defeat Britain. We would then take Canada by lunch the next day, and then we would say to Britain, before their ships even got here, tell you what, you give us Canada, and we'll call the whole thing off. Now, what do? We've won Canada, and we've stopped the Civil War before it's even begun. Is that not a good idea? And his Manifest Destiny ideas? Got it. Lincoln said something that he was going to say later. He said, no, I believe one war at a time. He didn't do it. But Seward never stopped thinking about it. Throughout the Civil War, he had American troops pushed up along the border, for reasons that I'll talk to you about in a second, and was itching with any little event that happened, and there were several, where it looked very much like the United States was going to invade Canada, to the point that Britain sent 11,000 troops over. 11,000 troops, and they sent the equivalent of about $3 million, which in those days was a lot of money. $3 million, that's more than I'm being paid for this. $3 million, $3 million was a lot of money. And they were going to build, they were building the fortifications at Quebec City and Montreal and Toronto, like Fort York, down in Niagara, Fort George, Fort Henry, all those forts were being built up. Warships were put on the Great Lakes. The old War of 1812 deal, where there was no militarized ships on the Great Lakes, forget it. It was remilitarized because the Americans were coming, and we knew it. The guy who was still the Attorney General, but now he appointed himself, he was in effect the Prime Minister, and everybody knew it. Now he appointed himself the Minister of Militia, reorganized the militia units. And everybody in Canada, again, the southern part of Canada, Ontario and Quebec, everybody of a certain age, 18 to 50, I'm out of that, but 18 to 50, had to serve in the militia once a month, 2 days of training. He got guns, he got newer guns, Enfield rifles, the best muskets you could have in those days, and there was even a militia unit from Lakefield that was set up. And we were going to go down, and our job was to go down to Port Hope or Cobourg, wherever they were coming. But we were ready. The Americans were on their way. The Civil War hasn't even started yet, but they're coming, and they know we're coming. Another person that I talk about is a fascinating person. Picture a young person named Franklin Thompson. Franklin Thompson is born in New Brunswick into poverty and moves, as many people do in those days, for work down in the United States. He's now a Bible salesman, and Franklin Thompson is selling Bibles in Chicago, Illinois, when he hears that the Civil War has begun. When the Civil War begins, he could have just gone home to New Brunswick, but he doesn't. He signs up. He becomes a male nurse because he had done, first aid training and stuff growing up on the farm. Becomes a male nurse. There were no female nurses at the time. It was believed in those days that women were not smart enough. To every woman in the room, I apologize. To my wife at home over the bridge, I apologize. Women were not smart enough. Women were too emotionally unstable. And if you have them as nurses, they might, aghast, see a man's body. Can't have that happen. So therefore, all the nurses were men. So Franklin Thompson becomes a male nurse, is at the first Battle of Bull Run. The first Battle of Bull Run happened so close to the White House, it's just down the road, that Lincoln could actually hear the echoes of the booms in the mountains across the Potomac. That's how close it was. This was not a war that you send the guys over on the ship over across the ocean. This was a war that was happening within sight. If you stand at the White House, even today, and you look, you can see Virginia from there. That's the South. It was that close. Their capital is Richmond. You can get in a car now and drive. In 2 hours, you go between Richmond and Washington. It's that close. It's not somewhere over in Afghanistan or some place that we have to look up on a map. Well, when the South won that battle, back in Canada, at Quebec City, where the capital city was at that time, somebody ran in because the House of Commons was in session and said, the Confederacy has won the battle of the Civil War. A great cheer went up because the vast majority of Canadians were for the South. Lincoln had said in his inaugural address that he had no interest in freeing the slaves. This war was to save the Union. Also, people believed, well, this would actually work out kind of well, because if the South wins, or they negotiate a settlement, the United States will split up. It won't split up into two. It'll shatter. It'll be like Europe with all these little countries all over the place, and that's good for us. If they're weaker, we're stronger. So that's good. There was also all kinds of people who decided this is a pretty good opportunity to make some money. In New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, they were really good at it. In Nova Scotia, for example, what Lincoln did as soon as the war began is he set up all these ships along the border of the coast of the Confederacy so that cotton couldn't get to Britain and money and arms couldn't get back in. Well, what the Confederacy did, is they got all kinds of ships and they went to Bermuda, British colony, and then up to Halifax, got resupplied, and then over to Europe, where they took their cotton and got their guns and got their money. They snuck through. Did you ever see Gone with the Wind? Remember Rhett Butler? What was his job?
Oh, yeah.
He was the blockade runner. That's what Rhett Butler did. They all didn't look like him, but mustache. But all kinds of people, especially in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, made all kinds of money because they would sell all the supplies to the Confederate runner, and then in would come the Union ship looking for them, and they would sell all kinds of guns and supplies to them and say, no, I haven't seen them. The guy who made the most money there was a guy from Nova Scotia called Alexander Keith. We know him now for a different reason. Some people like him a lot, yes. So I haven't forgotten about Franklin Thompson. He has joined up and he's fought in the battle and he's being a nurse, but that's not adventure enough for him. So then he decides that he's going to be a dispatch rider, the most dangerous job in the Civil War. If this general wants to talk to that one, you can't pick up your cell phone. You have to give a message, and a guy has to ride on the horse along the front line and take it to the other general. They used to give everybody 3 messengers in the hope that one of them would get through. Incredibly dangerous. That wasn't exciting enough. So he volunteered to become a spy. He ran 10 different missions through his own lines, which is dangerous, through enemy lines, got all kinds of information, and then ran back and delivered the information. It's amazing. Do you know the most amazing part of Franklin Thompson's story? Is that Franklin Thompson was not his real name. His real name was Emma Edmonds. She was a woman disguised as a man. When she was 17 years old, her father came home and said, I am going to marry you to the farmer down the road because he has promised me, it was some cattle, I think it was, and we need that. So I'm going to basically sell you to the farmer down the road. She did the best thing she could think, took off with a friend of hers, a male friend of hers, who lent her clothes and got her out of town. He became Franklin Thompson. And then found, wow, I can actually find work. I can go in and have a pint. Can't do that as a woman in those days. I can lead a pretty good life. Joined up as a male nurse. One of the missions that Emma Edmonds was disguised as was she disguised herself as a woman. The rest of the guys in the regiment were amazed at how well she pulled it off. Now, the trick with Emma Edmonds is she is one of 40,000 Canadians that fought in the Civil War. 40,000. 29 of them won the Congressional Medal of Honor. The Lakefield Cemetery, just up the road, the Casement Lane, if you go in there, you will find a tombstone, and the stone, I forget the gentleman's name, but he fought in the Vermont 5th Regiment in the American Civil War. So you don't have to go far, you just walk up the road, and there's a guy who fought in the American Civil War just up the road. 40,000. A lot of them were in the United States, like Emma was, and signed up. And many of them moved from Canada and signed up because adventure. There was all kinds of young men who, like now, believed that they could make a little bit of money, that girls sure love a guy in uniform, and it's adventure. All kinds of people signed up that weren't 18, but in those days, maybe a little bit more than now, everybody went to church, and lying was a sin. So people did all kinds of things to get in without lying. The favorite trick was you would get a piece of paper, and you would write 18 on a little piece of paper, and then you would put it in your shoe, and you would walk up to the recruiter, and he would say, name? Yes. Are you over 18, son? Yes, sir. In you went. When the war dragged on, recruitment went down, and they instituted a draft. And when they instituted a draft, people used to get money for each person that they got into the army. They were called crimpers, and they used to come all over the United States and cajole people into joining, and they went into Canada and found people too. They would go to bars and drug drinks, and then the guy would wake up and he'd be in uniform in the States. They would hire prostitutes who would go up and seduce some young man, take him up into the room where he'd get a bonk over the head, and he'd suddenly be fighting for the Union. They got to the point in 1865, the last year of the war, where they were kidnapping kids from schoolyards. In Toronto and Montreal, mom would be waiting for her son to come home, and he wasn't coming home because he was now a soldier. 40,000 Canadians fought in the war. Now, another guy that I've talked about a couple of times without mentioning his name, but that I mentioned in the book, is Sir John A. Macdonald. Sir John A. Macdonald was just John A. Macdonald at this point, and John A. Macdonald was the Attorney General that I was telling you about, that took money out of his own pocket and gave it to John Anderson. John A. Macdonald was the Minister of the Militia that set all of this stuff up. John A. Macdonald was a lawyer from Kingston, and he was a very ambitious man. He was also a very intelligent man in terms of business, despite the fact that his business partner absconded with a lot of money and left him in more debt than he had assets. But at one point he was a land speculator, and one great piece of land he bought and then sold at a loss is now Beavermead Park in Peterborough. So Sir John A. Macdonald at one point owned Beavermead, or at least what became Beavermead. Now, let me move ahead to when it was 1863. It was 1863, which was in the middle of the war. And in July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, there was a couple of battles. And those two battles were the turning points in the war. One was in Vicksburg, down in the Mississippi River. And another one was Gettysburg. It was in Pennsylvania. Those two battles together, we won't go into the detail of the battle, but those two battles were the turning points in the war. They were the turning points in the war, just like D-Day was the turning point in the Second World War. Didn't end the war, but it changed it so much that everybody knew that the end was just down the road. Well, everybody knew that, including the president of the Confederacy, this guy named Jefferson Davis, who was a Mississippi senator. And what he said was, there is one thing that we need to do in order to get this war turned around. What we need to do is fight in a different way. He hired a friend of his. There was this guy named Jacob Thompson, not John Anderson, but Jacob Thompson, for a free trade agreement that allowed all kinds of Canadian goods to go down into the United States, but the American goods not to come back into Canada without tariff, which is amazing. Got a fish treaty, that's good. He got recognition because they agreed, we will not sign this treaty until it is approved by the American Senate, because it's a treaty, by the British Parliament, and by the Canadian Parliament. MacDonald insisted on it, they agreed. You see what they've just done? They just recognized Canada as a sovereign state equal to the United States and Britain. It's amazing. That's an amazing step in Canadian nationhood. The last thing they agreed to, the Alabama claims and those trades, it'll go to a separate arbitration panel, and they will deal with it, and it'll be in Geneva where all good talks happen. And the old Canada swap, off the table. So I think what I've talked about is how Sir John helped create Canada, and I think I've talked about how he saved Canada, and that's what I said I was going to talk about, so I must be done. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I never told you what happened to the slave. As Dean said, these books are for sale at the back. And that's chapter 1. Are there any other questions? Any other questions at all? Yes, sir.
I'm curious as to what role the Fenians might have played around the 1870s.
Fenians played an enormous role because when the American Civil War ended and Lincoln was killed, and therefore the United States began inward looking, and a lot of their army dissolved, and a lot of them went to fight the Indian War. I mean, all the cowboy movies we've ever seen are the Indian Wars after the Civil War. A lot of Canadians said, well, I guess forget about it. The Americans aren't going to invade us, so forget it. And in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, they actually began to say, well, forget it, we're not going to join. PEI and Newfoundland have already said weren't going to join. And the government that was in support of Confederation was defeated in New Brunswick, and it looked like, well, I guess it's not going to happen. Just then, in 1866, a whole bunch of Irish Americans who were Civil War hardened, battle hardened veterans, they knew what they were doing. These guys had fought in the Civil War, came and organized themselves to take Canada. The reason they were going to take Canada, these Irish nationalists, they would then hold it and negotiate with Britain, and we'll trade Canada for Irish independence. And so they were going to attack. And raids were being organized on the border in New Brunswick, and they were organizing, and all kinds of guns and everything were coming up to the border. And the reason why the American government knew that those guns and those men were being mobilized on the border is because the Fenian leaders met in the White House with Johnson and said, when we take Canada, will you recognize us as a provisional government? And President Johnson and Seward said, yeah. And all of their guns they got from the armory, free of charge. So the Americans were very much in support of the Fenians. The Fenians did raid and get over the border, and they had a pitched battle in Ridgeway. In the book, I had a choice of a number of different ways to tell that battle story, and the way I told it was the diary of a guy who was a University of Toronto student who fought in the Battle of Ridgeway, and he was from Peterborough. And it was these battles and these threats that enough Canadians, and especially the people from the Maritimes and from Nova Scotia, said, I guess the threat is not over, and they changed their minds and supported Confederation. So again, American Civil War and the Civil War veterans played an enormous part in there being a Canada, or else Canada would have been just Quebec and Ontario. Yes? No, it was very much a conspiracy. The trial that happened shortly after, because everybody knew it was Booth that did it. He shot him in the Ford's Theater and then jumped out of the box, landed on the stage, broke his leg, and stood there and said, "Death to all tyrants." And everybody looked and they said, "Hey, John Wilkes Booth." It'd be like Tom Cruise jumping down after shooting a bomb. Everybody says, "Tom Cruise." Everybody knew him, so there's no question that he had done it. The same day, not the same day, almost the same moment that Lincoln was shot, Seward was lying in his bed, and a man up into his room attacked him with a knife and nearly killed him. There was another guy that was going to kill the vice president, but he lost his nerve and got drunk. And there was another guy that was going to kill Grant, but Grant had left town. So it was very much a conspiracy. They found the guys, and when they found Booth, they put together a contingent of 29 people under this lieutenant colonel, because they'd heard that Booth was escaping out that way, and because he had broken his leg. And the guy who was in charge was a guy from Montreal. The guy who caught Booth was a Canadian. In fact, the guy who set his leg was a doctor, and he was put in trial too. His name was Dr. Mudd. And that's why, when you were in trouble, when you were a little kid, did you ever hear your mother say, "If you do that, your name will be"? That's where that comes from. It was Dr. Mudd that set John Wilkes Booth's leg. Any other questions? Yes. Very much a part. That's what part of what the Riel Rebellion was all about, and that's why Sir John had to get Riel and stop him again in Saskatchewan, because part of what Riel was doing was negotiating with the American. A part of the story that's not often told. Right. Yeah, Gabriel Dumas and that whole thing. So I think, yeah. Are we done? Oh, Dean's standing up, so we must be done.
A question, John, and I'm not sure.
Good. Thank you very much.
I do want to say that we have never heard such people tidying up like these. Just let a world class big sloop. And the manner in which he left speak and his chest and vocabulary, in fact, that very on behalf of our nation, such a wonderful.
Terrific. Thank you. This will go in my office, and thank you for that embarrassing tribute. I'll leave you with a story, and that is that the University of Laval translated Blood and Daring into French, and so it was released in France, in French, in response to the remarks that Dean just made, I will say that my wife's job on this planet is to keep me humble, and she's expert at it because she's been at it for over 30 years. When the man from Purelator came and delivered the box of books to me, and I opened them up, and there it was, this French translated book. I was so proud, and I said, "Look at this." And he said, "Oh, that's great, John. You've now written a book that you can't read."
Congratulations, John. I was just going to ask you a question. I had it at the Historical Society in Lakeville. We have a plaque that was presented to a Lakefield man who fought in the Fenian raids against the Fenians.
Yep.
And we have that plaque in our historical society, and I might bring it to one of the meetings just to let people read it. It's a fascinating. The village of Lakefield actually acknowledged the services of this chap from Lakefield who fought in the Fenian raid, and his name was Bell. He was one of the Bells, one of the famous Bells. And I met another chap 2 weeks ago, and he claimed to own the ruins of a large battleship that the Brits built in Kingston for the War of 1812. And he said that he ended up at a party one night, and the next morning he had a piece of paper stuck in his back pocket, and it said he was the owner of the skeleton of this ship. And he says he owns it. As far as he knows, he said he paid a lot for it. $25, he said he paid. And the only thing he